Alright, so in this third video, we will be looking at vulnerable populations. So I'll be discussing how social workers intervene on behalf of different vulnerable populations. I'll be discussing how social workers intervene in a micro, macro, and meso social work level. And also, I'll be giving a few examples of the different issues that a few vulnerable populations face. So, in order to understand what a vulnerable population is, it's basically a group of people that face different disadvantages in some way in comparison to other groups or in comparison to the whole. So, a couple disadvantaged groups would be elderly, children, women, of course, minorities, LGBTQ, and people with certain medical conditions. So, that's what different vulnerable populations are. Now, how social workers come into play. There's different levels of social work intervention. So, the first being what's called micro. The micro level is basically working with individuals or even families. You're working with individual persons, which is similar in a way to developmental social welfare. With developmental social welfare, again, you're working with individuals. So that's a micro, it's a small scale level of social work intervention. The next would be the meso level, which is going to be small groups, small communities, schools, small programs, things like that. It's like in the middle between the small group and the big group. So you're looking at helping church organizations, local community organizations, things like that. And then the final level of social work intervention would be the macro level. So, on the macro level, which makes me think of institutional social welfare, the macro level is dealing with larger communities, large scale populations, policy reform, things that on a big grand scheme of things. And one thing that is so neat, you could be working on different levels of social work. They kind of just transcend and you may not even realize it. So I have an example for that for later too. So the economy and political environment would also be examples of macro level social work. So a couple examples of intervention when you're dealing with a micro level, again, that's going to be like a social worker who works in a school. You may have a social worker that works in a local high school, a small school, and they may come up with career preparedness programs to help those children in that school. So maybe think of like at-risk youth in a disadvantaged community with a school that may not have so much funding. So you may have a social worker in that high school that has programs to prepare those students for job fields in the future. And then another example is there is a program called it's called Critical Time Intervention. And I believe it's in the New York area. But with that program, the social workers, they're helping people dealing with mental illness transition from homeless shelters so that they can continue their transition without becoming homeless again. So that's a real deal program. And like I mentioned a moment ago, that deals with, yes, the individual person, but then it's kind of going into the meso level also, because not only are you helping individual persons suffering from mental illness and homelessness, you're helping that population or that community of the homeless, or so it transcends from a micro level to a meso level. So couple and then here's another one. I have an example in Nevada. In the state of Nevada, for persons who are unemployed or on unemployment, they have a mandatory program so that you can basically have help looking for new employment. So, in that way, the program itself is mandatory, and that program itself would kind of be a macro level because it's the entire state of Nevada and it's helping the entire unemployment population in Nevada. Also, it would be containing micro level social work because you have social workers working with individual persons. So they kind of mix. Another example of meso level social work would be group therapy, things like that, social outreach programs. And then when you're looking at macro level, you're looking at advocating for at risk populations. So, policy reform and advocation, and planning, implementing, and maintaining social programs. So, I have an example of number one, a vulnerable population, the kind of the challenges that they face, and then how we would look at that situation on a micro, meso, and macro level. So when we're dealing with children, and children, of course, are a vulnerable population, and there's so many different challenges they face, things from poverty and